You can name Armstrong, maybe Aldrin, but the man who traveled farther from Earth than any human being in recorded history was neither of them, and by the end of this video, you will know his name. 24 Americans crossed the 240,000 miles that separate the Earth from the Moon between 1968 and 1972. 12 walked on the surface. The other 12 did not. Some orbited. Some flew alone across the far side while their crewmates descended without them. One was supposed to land and never got the chance, because an oxygen tank tore itself apart 186,000 miles from home. To sort them properly, I went back to the 11 crewed missions of the Apollo program, and to the NASA service records and mission reports of all 24 crewmen. What is at stake is not a trivia list. It is the difference between remembering one name and understanding the other 23 men who paid to put that name on the surface. Because reaching the moon and landing on the moon are not the same thing. 6 Apollo missions put boots on the dust. 5 did not. And the men who flew those 5 missions are the ones history forgets first. These are all the Americans who reached the moon in the order they arrived. Every one of those 24 seats passed through the same filter, and that filter had a first and last name. Donald Kent Slayton, whom everyone called Deke, was one of the original Mercury 7. Air Force test pilot. He never left the pad. 3 months before his assigned flight, a routine medical exam picked up atrial fibrillation, and NASA pulled him off the list. Instead of retiring him, they put him in charge of deciding who flew. The man with his hands tied on the ground, writing in chalk the names of the men who would cross the distance that had been taken from him. And Slayton wrote a rule. If you were the backup on a mission, you rotated to prime 3 missions later in the same seat. The rotation was so rigid that if you looked at the board in January of 1969, you could predict with certainty which 3 men were going to be standing on the surface of the moon in July. NASA selected its future astronauts in 4 rounds: the Mercury 7 in 1959, the New 9 in 1962, the 3rd group in 1963, and the 4th in 1965, 6 civilian scientists, of whom only 1 ever walked on the surface. At the peak of the program, NASA had roughly 40 active astronauts in rotation. 24 crossed the distance. 12 touched the ground. Slayton himself did not fly until 1975, when they finally lifted his cardiac restriction and gave him a seat on the last Apollo mission. He did not go to the moon. He met a Soviet spacecraft in low Earth orbit. With the board explained, they can be read in order. And the first name is not on Apollo 11. It is on the mission NASA rewrote on the fly, because the Soviets were weeks away from winning the race. In August of 1968, a NASA engineer named George Low proposed rewriting Apollo 8. The lunar module was months behind schedule, but the Saturn V was ready, and military intelligence was reporting that the Soviets had sent turtles around the moon aboard the Zond 5 probe and recovered them alive. The next Zond could carry a cosmonaut, therefore cut the low Earth orbit test. Cut the lunar module. Send the spacecraft to the moon. 3 men, 10 orbits, home again. The 3 were Frank Borman, Commander, Air Force Colonel; Jim Lovell, Navy Captain, in the command module pilot seat; and Bill Anders, Air Force Major, first flight, reassigned as systems engineer and onboard photographer, because the lunar module he was supposed to fly had not flown yet. When they crossed to the far side of the moon on Christmas Eve, they lost radio contact for 34 minutes. In that silence, Borman fired the service module engine to slow the ship into orbit. If the engine failed, they were either stranded or dead. It fired clean and burned the exact 4 minutes required. 10 orbits.
On the 9th, Borman rolled the spacecraft. Through the side window, something appeared that was not in the flight plan. Anders saw it first. The Earth rising above the lunar horizon. A blue disk against absolute black. Anders was holding a Hasselblad loaded with black and white film for surface photography. He shouted at Lovell to hand him the color roll. He swapped the magazine. He fired 2 exposures. The second one is the most reproduced photograph of the 20th century. Nobody planned it. It was an accident caused by a routine roll of the spacecraft. That night, the 3 men broadcast live to an audience of roughly 1 billion people. Anders started, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." Borman closed, "Good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth." They came home on the 27th of December. None of them returned to the moon. Borman died in 2023. Anders died in 2024 flying his own airplane. Lovell died in 2024. They had reached the moon. They had not landed, and the next mission got so close to the surface that the crew could read the rocks through the window, and their orders were explicit. Do not touch the ground. On the 22nd of May, 1969, 2 men separated a lunar module called Snoopy from the command module and began falling toward the surface. They stopped at exactly 9 miles above the ground, turned around, and climbed back. The official reason is that Snoopy was not certified to land. But for decades, another version has circulated, told by Gene Cernan himself, that the lander was deliberately short-fueled so the crew could not give in to the temptation. The commander was Tom Stafford. Next to him, Cernan, in the lunar module pilot seat. The two had already flown together on Gemini 9A. Above them stayed John Young, Navy captain, first human being to orbit the moon alone, during the 8 hours Stafford and Cernan spent inside Snoopy. When the moment came to jettison the descent stage and ride the ascent stage back up, a control switch was in the wrong position on the checklist. Combined with another one Stafford threw, it sent the ascent stage automatically hunting for the command module before it was ready to maneuver. Snoopy started spinning end over end. Stafford flipped to manual and stabilized the ship. They later said they were 8 seconds away from total loss of control. On the return leg to Earth, the spacecraft reached 24,791 miles per hour. 57 years later, it is still the fastest speed a human being has ever traveled. Stafford died in 2024. Cernan would return to the moon on Apollo 17. Young would fly the first space shuttle and later the 9th. 6 space flights in total. No other human being has ever matched that. Apollo 11 would land more than 4 miles off its intended target. And to justify the missions that followed, somebody had to prove you could put a spacecraft exactly where you wanted it. 36 seconds after liftoff, the Saturn V of Apollo 12 was struck by lightning. 5 seconds later, a second bolt hit it again. Inside the cabin, every warning light on the panel came on at once. The telemetry reaching Houston turned to garbage. The 3 men on board were blind. The commander was Pete Conrad, 5'6", the shortest astronaut in the program. To his right, Dick Gordon. In the third seat, Alan Bean, first flight, about to become the 4th human being to walk on the moon. In Houston, a 24-year-old controller named John Aaron recognized the pattern of corrupted data. A year earlier, in a simulation, he had seen exactly that signature. He passed a 4-word phrase to the flight director on the internal loop. "Flight, try SCE to AUX." Nobody in the room knew what he meant. Bean, in the third seat, found the switch. It was a small switch in a corner of the panel that almost nobody ever touched. He moved it to the auxiliary position. The telemetry came back clean. Engineers discovered afterward that the lightning had also damaged the guidance computer of the emergency abort system. If they had aborted, they would have ejected under a parachute controlled by a computer that no longer worked. 5 days later, Conrad and Bean descended in the lunar module Intrepid to the ocean of storms. NASA had marked the landing point within walking distance of the robotic Surveyor 3 probe. Dead on the surface since 1967. Conrad landed less than 600 feet from it. He could see the probe through the window before he touched down. When he came down the ladder, Conrad delivered the line he had been preparing for weeks. Whoopee. Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me. He had bet a reporter $500 he would say that exact sentence to prove NASA did not script the astronauts. He won the bet. The reporter never paid him. They cut pieces off Surveyor 3, including its camera, and brought them home. The camera is in the Smithsonian today. Gordon never returned to space. Slayton had promised him command of Apollo 18, which was canceled by budget cuts. He died in 2017. Conrad died in a motorcycle accident in 1999. Bean later reinvented himself as a painter, working in oils that included real dust from his boots. He died in 2018. The next mission would lose a crewman 72 hours before launch, and that substitution would save the life of the man left on the ground. 55 hours into the third day of flight, an oxygen tank exploded inside the service module of Apollo 13. Jack Swigert keyed the microphone and said a line that has been misquoted for 50 years. What he said was, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. Past tense, not present." The line was later popularized in the present tense by a movie. The commander was Jim Lovell, 4th spaceflight. He was going to be the 5th human being to walk on the moon. To his right, Swigert. The original prime was Ken Mattingly. 72 hours before launch, Charlie Duke, the lunar module pilot on the backup crew, brought German measles into the training group after his young son caught it. Mattingly had no immunity. Slayton pulled him and called Swigert up from the backup crew. Swigert had 3 days to memorize procedures Mattingly had been rehearsing for 2 years. In the third seat sat Fred Heisey. The tank exploded because of a stripped wire left inside 3 years earlier. During a ground test, 65-volt heaters had burned out thermostats designed for 28 volts. The Teflon insulation on the internal wiring melted. When Swigert followed the routine procedure of stirring the tanks, the spark ignited what was left of the insulation. The command module was now unusable. Everything, life support, propulsion, guidance, had to come from the lunar module Aquarius, designed for 2 people over 2 days on the surface, not 3 people over 4 days of return to Earth. Ground engineers improvised an adapter out of cardboard, duct tape, and a section of sock so the square carbon dioxide filters from the command module would fit the round tubes of the lunar module. Without that adapter, all 3 would have suffocated in their own breath in under 10 hours. 248,655 miles. That is the farthest point from Earth any human being has ever reached. Lovell, Swigert, and Heise hit it when the free return trajectory swung them behind the moon. They splashed down on the 17th of April. Lovell died in 2024. Swigert won a seat in the House of Representatives from Colorado in 1982 and died of bone cancer 7 days before he could be sworn in. Heisey flew the atmospheric approach and landing tests of the Space Shuttle Enterprise but never reached orbit. And Mattingly, the man NASA had pulled over an illness he never caught, spent the following months convinced he had been robbed of the flight of his life. He would fly on the next opportunity, but before that, NASA had to send back into space the first American who had ever left the ground. When Alan Shepard came down the ladder of the lunar module Antares on the 5th of February 1971, he had not flown in space for 9 years and 9 months. His first flight had lasted 15 minutes on a Mercury Redstone in 1961. His second was going to last 33 and a half hours, take place on the moon, and never should have existed. In 1963, NASA diagnosed him with Meniere's disease, an inner ear disorder that causes vertigo and hearing loss. They pulled him from active flight status. For 6 years, he watched other men fly while he signed paperwork as head of the Astronaut office. In 1968, an ear surgeon in Los Angeles named William House proposed an experimental operation. Shepard traveled to Los Angeles under a false name and had the surgery in secret. It worked. 9 months later, NASA restored his flight status. Slayton gave him command of Apollo 14. At 47, he was the oldest astronaut ever to fly, Rear Admiral, United States Navy. With him flew Stuart Roosa, an Air Force colonel who had worked as a forest fire smoke jumper before flight school, and Ed Mitchell, an MIT doctorate. During the flight, Mitchell ran 4 unauthorized sessions of psychic symbol transmission to collaborators back on Earth. The results were statistical noise. When Shepard and Mitchell separated for the descent to Fremaro, the computer picked up a false abort signal from a loose ball of solder in a switch. A 26-year-old engineer at MIT named Don Iles spent 2 hours writing an 81 keystroke workaround that would fool the computer into ignoring the false signal without losing real abort capability. Mitchell typed the sequence in the exact order while the spacecraft descended. It worked, and at less than 30,000 feet, the landing radar failed. Shepard refused to abort. He ordered the radar cycled off and back on. On the second try, it came up. They stopped 100 feet short of the rim of Cone Crater without knowing it. They never saw the inside of the crater they had traveled to see. Roosa orbited alone. In his personal locker, he carried 400 tree seeds from the United States Forest Service. When they returned, the seeds were planted across the country. They are known as the moon trees. Some are still alive. Before climbing the ladder for the last time, Shepard produced an object he had smuggled past the weight check inside a sock. It was the head of a Wilson Staff 6-iron golf club, screwed to the handle of a sample collection tool. He took 2 one-handed swings. The suit would not let him use both hands. At 2 golf balls he had brought without authorization. The first barely moved. The second, he set on the loop, went miles and miles and miles. Later, photographic analysis put the actual flight at about 40 yards. Shepard died in 1998, Roosa in 1994, Mitchell in 2016. The next mission would completely change what an astronaut could do on the surface, and its 3 crewmen were carrying contraband in their pockets that NASA would not discover until after the flight. Apollo 15 was the first of the 3 J missions. 3-day surface stay, redesigned suits, and a 4-wheeled electric vehicle folded like metallic origami inside the lunar module. The commander was David Scott, Air Force Colonel. He had flown Gemini 8 with Armstrong, the docking emergency that had nearly killed both of them. Al Worden flew as command module pilot. And here one of the most repeated myths of spaceflight needs correcting. Michael Collins was not the loneliest human being in history. Al Worden was. When the command module Endeavour passed behind the moon, Worden was cut off from ground control by the mass of the moon itself. No radio, no other human being within a radius of 1,300 miles, 74 orbits. The formal Guinness record was awarded to him, not to Collins. Jim Irwin flew as lunar module pilot, an evangelical Christian engineer who carried in his pocket a small Bible printed on photographic film. On the surface, Scott and Irwin used the rover on 3 separate excursions. They covered 17 miles. Scott found a rock more than 4 billion years old, formed during the initial cooling of the lunar crust. They called it the Genesis Rock. On the final excursion, Scott ran a demonstration he had been planning for months. In front of the camera, he held a geologist's hammer in one hand and a falcon feather in the other. He dropped them at the same instant. They hit the ground at the same moment. Galileo, 400 years earlier, had predicted exactly that result without being able to prove it. Before the last climb, he placed on the ground a small aluminum sculpture, the stylized figure of a fallen astronaut face down. Beside it, a plaque with 14 names, 8 American, 6 Soviet, of the astronauts and cosmonauts who had died in the effort to reach space. The original is still there. Within weeks of returning, the problem surfaced. Before the flight, a German intermediary had offered the 3 men $7,000 each to carry 400 stamped and franked postal covers to the moon. They did not declare them. When the agency found out, an investigation opened. Scott, Worden, and Irwin received formal reprimands. None of them ever flew in space again. Irwin founded a Christian ministry. He said publicly that on the surface of the moon he had felt the physical presence of God. He spent the rest of his life searching for Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat. He died in 1991. Worden died in 2020. Scott is alive. 96 hours into the flight, Ken Mattingly fired the main engine of the command module to reposition the ship in lunar orbit. The guidance system began oscillating. Mattingly shut it down at 10 seconds. Without a guaranteed way home, there was no landing. John Young and Charlie Duke, already suited and ready to descend, were told to hold. The cancellation was formally signed for 6 hours. After analysis, it was reversed. The commander was Young, already known from this video. Mattingly, pulled from Apollo 13, 72 hours before launch over a German measles case he never caught, finally flew to the moon. He died in October of 2023, and Duke flew as lunar module pilot. Duke already had his place in the history of the program. During the descent of Apollo 11, he was the man in Houston talking to the spacecraft. When Armstrong reported that the Eagle had landed, Duke answered, "Roger, Tranquility. We copy you down, Eagle." The S in Tranquility came out as a wow-a because of nerves. 3 years later, he was coming down the same ladder himself. Duke and Young were the 9th and 10th human beings to walk on the moon. They found that the Descartes Highlands were not volcanic, as 20 years of geological hypothesis had assumed. They were impact-brecciated rock. Before climbing the ladder for the last time, Duke pulled a small plastic-wrapped package from his suit pocket. Inside was a color photograph of his wife and his 2 young sons. He placed it on the dust and photographed it. On the back, before the flight, he had written in black marker, "This is the family of astronaut Charlie Duke from planet Earth. Landed on the moon, April 1972. The photograph is still there. Young died in 2018. Duke died in November of 2024. Only one mission remained, and on it, for the first and only time, the lunar module pilot seat would not be filled by a military pilot." In July of 1971, NASA announced that the Apollo 17 crew would be Gene Cernan, Ron Evans, and Joe Engle. Engle was an Air Force colonel, one of the few men on Earth who had flown the X-15 rocket plane above the official altitude of space. 5 months later, NASA changed the list. Engle was out. In his place, Harrison Schmitt, geologist, Harvard PhD, from the 4th astronaut group selected in 1965. With Apollo 18, 19, and 20 already canceled, by Nixon, 17 was the last opportunity to put a scientist on the moon. The geological community pushed. NASA gave in. Engle stayed on the ground. Cernan flew as commander. Evans, in the command module, had been a Navy combat pilot in Vietnam before joining NASA. And Schmitt was about to become the 12th and last human being to walk on the moon. The only one of the 12 without a military uniform. Apollo 17 lifted off on the 7th of December at 12:33 in the morning, the only night launch of the program. The light of the Saturn V ignited was seen from Cuba, over 180 miles away. They landed at the Torres Litro Valley. They collected 243 pounds of samples. No subsequent mission has surpassed that figure in 53 years. On the second excursion near Shorty Crater, Schmidt looked at the ground and said on the loop, "Oh, hey, wait a minute. There is orange soil." Cernan thought Schmidt's visor was tinted. Schmidt insisted. A band of intense orange dust glowed against the surrounding gray. Schmidt, the geologist, recognized the pattern in the moment. Volcanic glass beads. When the samples were analyzed on Earth, Schmidt was right. The orange beads were volcanic glass roughly 3.5 billion years old. Direct evidence of lunar volcanism in a period previously assumed to be dead. And the discovery probably would not have been made if a military test pilot, and not a geologist, had been sitting in that seat. Before climbing the ladder of the lunar module for the last time, Cernan said on the open loop a line he had been writing for weeks. "As we leave the moon at Torres Litro, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." He climbed the ladder. He sealed the hatch. The lunar module Challenger lifted off, and from that moment to the moment of this video, no human being has walked on the surface of the moon again. Cernan died on the 16th of January, 2017. The title of the last man on the moon still holds. Evans died in 1990. Schmidt served one term as United States Senator for New Mexico. He is alive. Only one chapter remained. The first one. 3 minutes into the descent toward the Sea of Tranquility, the guidance computer issued an alarm neither of the two men on board had memorized. Program 1202. In Houston, a 23-year-old engineer named Jack Garman was looking at the same alarm on a handwritten list he had taped to his console 3 days earlier. The list said the alarm was not fatal. Garman passed it to the guidance officer, Steve Bales. Bales passed it to the flight director, Gene Kranz. Kranz called Geo. The cause was found later. Aldrin had left the rendezvous radar switched on as a precaution. The radar was feeding the computer data it did not need but had to process, saturating the processor. The system was prioritizing critical tasks and dropping the rest, raising the alarm each time it did so. It was working exactly as its MIT designers had intended, but nobody on the spacecraft knew that. At about 1,700 feet, Armstrong looked out the window and saw that the computer's target was inside a field of boulders the size of cars. He took manual control. He flew the lunar module sideways like a helicopter, hunting for smooth ground. 60 seconds. 60 seconds to mandatory abort on fuel. 30 seconds. Aldrin. Contact light. The 6-foot probe hanging from the foot of the module touched the ground. Armstrong killed the engine. Post-flight analysis determined there was probably fuel for about 45 more seconds of flight. The real-time reading, more pessimistic, had been 17. Aldrin. Houston. Tranquility Base. Here. The Eagle has landed. The commander was Neil Armstrong. Civilian since 1962. Before that, 7 flights of the X-15. Before the X-15, 78 combat missions in Korea. Shot down once and flying his F-9F Panther back to base with part of a wing sliced off by a cable. On Gemini 8, he had been seconds away from death in an uncontrolled spin and had stabilized it on reflex alone. NASA gave him command of Apollo 11 partly because that day he had proved he did not lose composure under extreme stress, and because as a civilian, he put the first man on the moon out of uniform. Aldrin, Air Force Colonel, MIT doctorate on orbital rendezvous. Before the doctorate, a fighter pilot in Korea with 2 MiG-15 kills. On Gemini 12, he had run the first fully successful American spacewalk. And above, in the command module Columbia, stayed Michael Collins. When the ship passed behind the moon, He was cut off from radio contact for 48 minutes on every orbit. Collins wrote about the experience in his book Carrying the Fire, in a line that fixed his name in popular culture. "I am alone now, truly alone, and absolutely isolated from any known life." Aldrin came down the ladder 20 minutes after Armstrong. Before stepping out, without telling Houston, he pulled from his personal kit a small pouch containing unleavened bread and a vial of wine. He was an elder in the Presbyterian Church. He read himself a passage from the Gospel of John and took communion, the first Christian communion celebrated off the earth. They spent 2 hours and 31 minutes on the surface, and they left 4 objects that are still there: a medallion honoring the cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, killed in a plane crash the previous year, a patch from the Apollo 1 mission honoring Grissom, White, and Chaffee, a gold olive branch, and a plaque: "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Armstrong, coming down the ladder, delivered the line that would define the 20th century. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. He maintained until the day of his death that he had said for a man, a single man, but that the indefinite article had been lost in transmission. Acoustic analysis has never resolved the question. They splashed down on the 24th of July. They spent 21 days in biological quarantine, in case they had brought back lunar microorganisms. Armstrong left active flight 1 year later. He refused nearly every interview. He signed personal autographs until he found out they were being resold for thousands of dollars, and then he stopped. He died on the 25th of August, 2012. Aldrin left NASA in 1971. He spent the following years fighting depression and alcoholism. He recovered. He is alive. Collins left NASA in 1970. He was the first director of the National Air and Space Museum. He died in April of 2021. 24 Americans crossed the 240,000 miles between 1968 and 1972. 12 walked. 12 watched from above. The 24 names you just heard are not separable from the machines that carried them: Yankee Clipper, Aquarius, Snoopy, Kitty Hawk, Falcon, Casper, Challenger, Columbia. Each one is a capsule, a module, or a vehicle with its own motor. And behind each one is a story of engineering that begins in 1958 with a capsule the size of a refrigerator and ends 14 years later with an electric vehicle rolling on another world. Before Apollo, there was Gemini. Before Gemini, there was Mercury. And across the 3 generations, NASA built, flew, and retired every piece of hardware that put those 24 men 240,000 miles from home. It is all here, every spacecraft in order, explained.